Hello and welcome to Glasgow Doors Open Day's Digital Festival. This event will begin soon, but first we have a brief housekeeping message. So that you can get the most out of this session, we'd like to point out a few features of Zoom. By clicking on the buttons at the bottom of the Zoom window, you will be able to access the chat room, and if you are in a webinar, you will also be able to make use of the Q&A function. The Q&A function is so that you can ask specific questions of the speaker, which they will be able to answer time allowing at the end of the session. Use the chat room to contribute more generally to the discussion or to share links and resources. When using these features, please mind your P's and Q's. Both will be monitored and recorded. Most sessions will be recorded and uploaded to Glasgow Doors Open Days Festival YouTube channel and website. If you're in a meeting, please make sure you keep your microphone on mute unless otherwise directed by the host. If for some reason the session ends unexpectedly or you lose connection, please just click the link again and wait to be let back in. Similarly, if the host loses connection, please bear with us. We will do our best to manage any connection issues as and when they occur, and may contact you by email if necessary. Thank you so much for joining us today. We'd love to hear about your experience of our digital festival. Fill in our survey to be in with a chance of winning a £100 voucher for a Glasgow local business of your choice. Our survey is available at www.glasgowdoorsopendays.org.uk/survey. Thanks to our supporters, the Arlington Bass Club, Glasgow City Council and the many more, which you can find out about on the partners page of our website. We hope you enjoy this event. Hello and welcome to Glasgow Doors Open Days Festival. Thank you for joining us this evening. As well as getting back into buildings at the weekend and our digital programme, which is happening throughout the week, we've also launched our own digital radio station for the first time ever, and that is broadcasting 24 hours a day for the duration of the festival. So I would encourage you to log on and to check that out while it's still there. On to this evening's event. Dr. Elsa Boyd is an independent writer and lecturer in 19th century art, design and literature, with a particular interest in the decoration of homes we live in and imagined spaces. Her academic publications include Beatrix Whistler, Manuals of Household Taste, Henry James's Home in Rye, and Edith Wharton's Interior Design. She is currently completing a monograph, Identity and Domestic Spaces in Victorian Literature, Houses in Fiction in George Eliot, Henry James and Edith Wharton. I'm very glad to introduce to you Elsa Boyd.
Good evening, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen so we can see my images. Great. So I usually write on Victorian interior decoration and literature, but I've gone really local for this talk. I'm going to do a bit of a house through time on my own house, which is this Victorian semi-detached villa in Crosshail. I will look at the first family who lived here and also the architect who built it. I wanted to know when my house was built, so I did a historic newspaper search and turned up a fascinating story of a fatal incident. When I dug deeper, I discovered that despite modest beginnings in the most industrial parts of Glasgow, the first family who lived in my house were upwardly mobile and moreover highly educated. Out of 8 children born in the Gorbals, 6 of them, including girls, had a university education. I'm going to start this story at the end. While taking a lockdown walk in Cathcart Cemetery last year, this large gravestone caught my attention for the name Battersby, an unusual name for Scotland. From the brief research I'd already done in my house, I knew that its first occupants were named Battersby. Could it be them? Buried beneath the stone pillars were Margaret Sutherland, aged 64 in 1913, beloved wife of James Mattersby, who joined her in 1920 at the age of 71, and their son, Dr. R. Gloag Battersby, buried there in 1941. But I knew there were other Battersby children, in particular William Mason Battersby, who had been convicted in 1897 of a violent assault which had taken place in my own home, an intriguing story behind this peaceful monument to familial affection. We will start in 1869, when James and Margaret set up home together. James Battersby was a 22-year-old engineer from Tibermuir in Perthshire when he married 18-year-old Margaret Sutherland of Camlachi in Glasgow in 1869 in Springburn. 10 months later, their first son was born at 29 West Greenhill Place. That's here in the middle of the map. This is in Anderston. The map is from 20 years after their son was born, but you can see that the street is just north of the North Basin of Queenstock, now filled in, and where the SEC is. It's just one of a few homes in the area. These tenements, which no longer exist, with their turnpike stairs, are very old. Just across the road was the Hyde Park Foundry, Finiston sawmills, and a brass foundry. This map from 1901 shows even more clearly what the area was like. This is their tenement building at number 29 here, which more than likely had external toilets. The young family is surrounded by the heavy industry that employed James and made up so much of Glasgow's urban fabric and created its wealth. On his first son's birth certificate in 1870, James Battersby was a journeyman iron turner. But by 1881, the census calls him a shopman chandler, living at 382 Cumberland Street in Hutchison Town near the Gorbals, and with a shop on Waddle Street just around the corner. To orient yourself on this map, since most of the Gorbals has been rebuilt twice, Thompson's ruined Caledonia Church is here, and another map tells us that this circular building next to it is actually a circus. Just to the south here are the colliery and ironworks, the famous Dixon's Blazes. This was the nickname for the Govan Ironworks owned by successive William Dixons, which had dominated the area since 1837. Located where the new Crown Street retail park is today, the huge furnaces lit up the night sky. By the 1840s, other industries were setting up in the area to be close to this hub of iron and coal. William Smith Dixon owned the nearby land and was directly responsible for many of the houses and municipal buildings of Crosshail. There was a peak in tenement building in Hutchison Town around 1871 to 1878, when most of the area south of Cumberland Street and east of Florence Street was laid out in a grid of long streets. Speculative builders filled these with working class tenements, mostly 1 or 2 roomed flats. The room and kitchen accounted for almost half of all dwellings built in Glasgow between 1862 and 1901. These dwellings were built right next to factories and industrial units which belched smoke and worse into the air, causing deadly bronchitis, TB and whooping cough. By 1899, the death rate in the Gorbals was 30% higher than the city average. It was the 3rd most overcrowded district in Glasgow, and in 1911, Hutchison Town had an average of 2.6 people per room. Many tenements built in the 1860s to 1880s in poorer areas only had a single dry privy in the back court for 8 flats, which could house more than 50 people. The 1881 census tells us the Battersbys are living on Cumberland Street with 3 children under 10, James, William and Caroline, in a flat that had only 1 room with 1 or more windows. Their neighbours' occupations are French polisher, a 13-year-old office boy, general clerk, factory operative, tobacco spinner, cap maker, former labourer, and a woman who's 64 and is a drawers maker. They lived in various flats in Cumberland Street in the 1880s, all in the 380s or 390s, near to each other. In 1887, they moved to 392 Cumberland Street, where Mary was born, and in 1890, their eldest son, who's now aged 20, is living in number 382, the flat with only 1 window. It's possible, but by this time, James had been frugal and managed to buy up a couple of flats to let out. No longer hired by the day to work in the heavy industry that dominated Glasgow, he was his own boss, running a fancy goods shop around the corner in Waddle Street, which sounds as though it could have sold a wide range of hardware. It was at number 157, which we can see marked on this map here, and it was close to the Hayfield Foundry and backing onto Govancroft Dye Works. We can see quite a bit of detail on this map, although elsewhere in these are Goad's insurance maps, Normally shops are indicated with an S. Here it just says tens for tenements, but I think a lot of these at ground level had shops. As we can see from this photograph, these photos from the 1950s, by which time the tenements had grown black from smoke and dilapidated from overcrowding. But it gives you some idea of what the streets looked like, with long runs of tenements, lots of shops, churches, theatres, and later on cinemas. There's the post office here at the very far left of this photograph, and this is actually right across the road from Mattersby's shop, which was just on here, just cut out of this photograph. The Paragon Cinema here, in 1910 it was a synagogue and it had been a free church before that. St Francis's Church next to it. There was the successor of Glasgow's first Franciscan friary and had been built in 1878 by Pugin and Pugin. And it's the only building in this photo that's still standing, but it's now converted into flats. In my family history research, I was so pleased to get in contact with descendants of the family, so I can now show you what they look like. Here are photos of James and Margaret Mattersby. Over 21 years, the Mattersbys had 8 children. James, born 1870, William Mason, born 1873, Caroline Younger, born 1877, David Hardy in 1881, Elizabeth Gloag, 1883, Margaret Sutherland, 1886, Mary Nicol Gunn, born 1887, and the last one, Robert Gloag, born in 1891. Their middle names reflect family names of Younger, Gloag, and Sutherland, which they would all carry into the next generation. There'll be more photos later. So the fancy goods business must have been profitable for about 1891, when their last child was born, Robert, who's the son on the gravestone. James Mattersby had bought a brand new villa of 6 apartments and attics at 100 Dixon Avenue in Crosshail, the house in which my family now live. Their new home is one of 8 semi-detached villas at 92 to 106 Dixon Avenue, built around 1887 to 91 by architect Robert Duncan. These distinctive bow-windowed houses were among the first to be built on the south side of the street on the ground next to the railway line. As you can see, the street is wide and each house has a front garden. At the back, there are small gardens to the railway line. In the 1888 Bartholomew's map, you can see the houses plotted out on the south side of the street and a few other terraced houses on the north side with large gap sides. Crosshail railway station opened in 1886 to serve the Cathcart District Railway and the people who lived in the newly built houses and tenements close by. This was Scotland's first suburban railway, and the houses built along it were for the middle classes, among the first to be commuting to the city centre for work. The chairman of the company, George Brown, was a shipping magnate and the first provost of the borough of Crosshill. By 1887, there were 32 trains running each way, 6 days a week, particularly on Saturdays, with football fans going to Cathkin and Handon Park. This map from 1882 shows that although far to the west, Pollokshields has been laid out in neat plots for villas, as has south of Albert Road, there are still a lot of empty fields in this area. It's crisscrossed by railway lines and surrounded by industry, goods yards, collieries and brickfields, Dixon's blazes and brickworks and locomotive works dominating the landscape near the Clyde. This was probably encouraged. Govanhill was known as no man's land because it had not been annexed into the city of Glasgow. This was probably encouraged by William Dixon, who owned most of the land and did not want municipal control over his ironworks. Crosshill to the south was a well-established small town and became an independent police borough in 1871. It's its 150th anniversary this year. After some years of what local historian Bruce Downey has called the Borough Wars, Crosshill and Govanhill were eventually annexed to the city of Glasgow in 1891. In the late 1890s, Crosshill must have been a constant building site, with houses and tenements being built westward along the railway line. In 1890, when annexation to Glasgow had first been thrown out, there were celebrations in Crosshill with a brass band and the fire brigade. But as the North British Daily Mail tells us, the great attraction to hundreds was a large bonfire kindled in a piece of vacant ground alongside the railway in Dixon Avenue. For about 3 hours, it burned and seemed to give considerable amusement to the spectators, old and young. The biggest building in the area is Dixon Hall, built in 1879 as a gift to the 2 boroughs of Govanhill and Crosshill from William Smith Dixon. It was a combination of public hall, business and courtrooms, one for each borough, placed on the boundary between them. Building began on the red sandstone Hutchison Town Free Church here at the end of the street, on the corner with Langside Road in 1891, and it opened in September 1893, the year that this map was drawn up. By 1900, Crosshail Cottage here, with its grounds and trees, had been replaced with the tenements of Boyd Street. It would take until 1904 for the whole south side of the street to be built, mostly designed by Duncan. The Holy Cross Church in Dixon Avenue was not built until 1911, so there was open ground on the opposite side of the street to the Mattersby's home. The houses are joined in pairs with single-storey entrance vestibules on the other side leading to a scullery. They're built of buff sandstone with slate roofs and have unusually round semicircular bay windows, decorative iron finials and wooden bracketing beneath the barge board along the roofline. My house had on the ground floor 2 reception rooms, a kitchen with a range and a scullery corridor leading to a toilet. Upstairs, 3 bedrooms and a bathroom, and an attic space split into 3 rooms. James Mattersby bought his house direct from its architect, Robert Duncan. The 1890 sale advert for the house in the Glasgow Herald is just below one for number 92, which was the architect's own house. 205 Hope Street was Duncan's offices. Not only are the drains smoke tested, but it is convenient for rail or car, that is, horse-drawn tram cars. This 1888 map shows the red tram lines going up Cathcart Road, past the landmark of the Borough Halls, looping around Queen's Drive and Victoria Road and back into the city centre. The trams were electrified throughout the city in 1898. So the original fur contract between William Smith Dixon's heirs and Robert Duncan for my house in 1889 states that he shall be bound and obliged to erect and complete a double villa, each half of which shall cost at least £300 sterling. Thanks to my neighbour, Amin Sharif, I've been able to see his original dispositions of sale, and in 1887, next door sold for £700. In 1898, 92 Dixon Avenue, just a few doors along from the Battersbys, was advertised for sale in the Herald for £750, with a fur duty of £3, 9 shillings and 2pence. In the early 1900s, a contemporary source tells us an annual wage of £700 was that of a typical rising professional man who had family expenses of about £487 a year, allowing £100 for rent and taxes. It's really difficult to make comparisons across time, but Battersby is certainly far from a journeyman iron turner. By 1905, he lists his occupation as portioner or house factor, indicating that he was letting out houses to others. Dixon Avenue was home to GPs, a wine and spirit merchant, biscuit manufacturer, retired carver and gilder, bank and law clerks, and a music teacher. The fur contract specified that the front gardens should be ornamental plots of grass and flowers, and that the villa should not be subdivided or erect any stable, byre or pigsty, or carry out any manufactory for making candles, soap, glue, Prussian blue, vitriol, or artificial manure. Many of the houses had names, not just numbers. 92 was Craigie Bank, when the architect lived there, and later Arthur Lee. 96 was Green Bray, as you can see written on the gate pier. 98 was Netherby, 100 Rose Lee, and others Thistlewood and Bell's Bank. The Battersbys seem well ensconced in middle-class security. However, just 6 years later, their second son, William, was the perpetrator of a violent crime which was splashed across the British newspapers. At about 3:45 in the morning of Sunday, the 24th of October, 1897, Mrs. Battersby had to call for a policeman because the family were afraid to stay in the house with her son, who had become unruly. Constables Heriot and Urquhart went to the house, finding William on the floor of the lobby with a number of members of the family holding him down. After being seized by the police, he calmed down, and as none of the family would make a charge, the police left but remained outside. A couple of minutes later, they heard shouting resumed in the house, and on going back in, Mr. Battersby told them to take his son into custody. Then, the Glasgow Herald tells us, Battersby walked into the scullery and, assuming a threatening attitude, is said to have declared that he would use the poker to the first person who came near him. Thereupon, Urquhart seized a chair and, holding it in front of him, endeavoured to overpower Battersby, who, it is said, struck him several blows on the head with the poker. Eventually, he was overpowered and taken to the police office, but while the charge was being made out, Urquhart, fell down as if in a fit, and died. There was only a small scar on his right temple. He was only 32 years old, with a wife and children, and had joined the force in 1889 after leaving Rossshire. The North British Daily Mail tells us, the sad event has created a great deal of excitement in the southern suburbs, and there was yesterday great sympathy expressed for the parents and Mattersby family, who are well known in the Crosshail district. Mattersby was remanded at Queen's Park Police Court, but liberated in the afternoon after a post-mortem showed that Urquhart had been suffering from heart disease. We can see this on his death certificate. It says heart disease of some standing over here. And that he died at 4:10 a.m, less than half an hour after he was called to Dixon Avenue. There's a note dated 23rd of November 1897 at the left-hand side, which must refer to Battersby's court case, but it's really illegible. So anybody who can read that, please tell me. But this death certificate also confirms that the police office was at Belle Isle Street. You can see from this map that Mrs. Battersby didn't have far to run to the police station. It's just across empty ground where the church now is. The fire and police offices were built at the same time as the Borough Hall and were also paid for by William S. Dixon. Part of the building was used as a stable for the fire station, and Belle Isle House here on the right was accommodation for police officers. You can see that they are in the same baronial Scottish baronial style as Dixon Halls, with crow-stepped gables and details that look like little arrow slits. It's now the Kelvin Amateur Boxing Club, which moved here from the West End in 1979. In 1891, when the City of Glasgow Act extended the city boundaries, the new G Division, or Queen's Park, was formed by annexing Pollokshields, Crosshail and Govanhill. The main police office moved to Craigie Street, which was built in 1896. This is a much larger building, but still in that baronial style, with its crow-stepped gables and little windows. It ceased being a main police office in 1990 and has now been converted into flats. And these policemen on the right from 1900, a lot of them would have been contemporaries of Constable Andrew Urquhart. So on the 19th of November 1897, William was brought before Baillie Fife at Queen's Park Police Court. There were originally two courthouses in the Borough Hall building, one for each borough, probably a bit like this, but after the annexation, trials would have taken place in Craigie Street. The Glasgow Herald tells us he's a medical student and is charged with conducting himself in a riotous and disorderly manner, using profane, abusive and threatening language, and attempting to force open the door leading from the lobby to the kitchen. This, on the far left, is the door today, and the door jamb does show signs of the door being hung the other way round. Definitely something happened to it. These two doors show the oldest paint effects we've got in the house, fake wood graining on the left-hand side, and then this dark green, which was in the scullery. And then that's my storm door on the right, which still has its original key. Back to Battersby, who is charged with assault and pleads guilty to all but the act of striking Urquhart with the poker. His solicitor, Nicholas F. Cameron, spoke of his heartfelt sympathy with the widow, the great shock and mental agony he had endured since then. And then we get some sort of explanation, as no one can be more sincere than he is to take no drink in future. After some legal wrangling over what constituted an assault, George Neilson, the police fiscal, was minded to accept the plea. Battersby's father was in the court to hear the verdict, and in a show of good faith, he had paid William's fees for his medical studies. Baillie Fife pronounced that he was a young man beginning a noble profession where a steady nerve, a steady hand, and a good head are most essential, but that he could not get over the fact of his reckless conduct of seizing a poker and flourishing it quite regardless of what might be the consequences. He sentenced Battersby to 30 days imprisonment. Astoundingly, at what we might see as a pretty lenient sentence, Battersby said contemptuously, "You might give me another month and be done with it." The North British Daily Mail reported that great public dissatisfaction has been caused by the legal procedure of the case, and they published a long article putting the case why Battersby ought undoubtedly to have been put on trial for culpable homicide. Nothing came of this. But later, a benefit concert was held for Urquhart's widow and children at the Dixon Hall on 27th of December 1897. and the many performers included the Glasgow Police Band, the Scottish Troubadours, Harry Lauder, and the ventriloquist Prince Bendon. Perhaps, as Battersby's solicitor predicted, imprisonment put an indelible stigma on his future. William Mason next appears in the records in 1899 when he marries Margaret Buchanan. He is no longer a medical student, but a receiving clerk. She is the daughter of an iron moulder in Waddle Street, where his father still has a shop. The same year, their daughter Margaret Sutherland Battersby is born, but her birth certificate declares her illegitimate. Presumably, William is heaping further shame on the family. On the 1901 census, he's listed as a visitor to Dixon Avenue, occupation clerk. He doesn't become a doctor, and he's deliberately not named as one of the children in his father's will. In fact, it took some researching for his descendants to find him, and it seems he died in Dalton in Lancaster in 1945 from a cerebral embolism and chronic nephritis, kidney disease. Aged 72, his former occupation was dock labourer. However, the rest of his family made more of their opportunities. Perhaps William could not live up to his elder brother's success in his studies. So the eldest brother, James Battersby Jr., never even lived at Dixon Avenue. He was 21 and had left home by the time they moved. He's listed in the electoral roll as a hardware shopman, presumably working in his father's shop in Waddle Street. But soon after this, he trained as a doctor in Glasgow, gaining his triple qualification in 1896. This was an extremely popular route to an initial medical qualification like a university degree, which was particularly accessible to students from marginal groups like the poor or women. He was practicing as a surgeon from 1900 at 622 Great Eastern Road in Parkhead, near Camlachie, where his mother was from. Some of this research has been pure luck and coincidence. When I Googled his address, this image came up on the Glasgow Story. From checking the post office directory and maps, this is his surgery, the Eastern Medical Hall, on the corner with Burger Street at Parkhead Cross, just here. He lived in the tenement building that you can just see to the right of this photograph, which still exists. However, in 1907-8, he moves across the road because these old buildings are being demolished and replaced with this, the Savings Bank of Glasgow, designed by John Keppie, which still stands on the Gallgate. If you look closely, you can see here that the left-hand shop is his surgery. It says surgery above the door, in the same footprint as where his surgery was before the demolition. And I'm pretty sure that his wife and 3 boys lived in the 4-bedroom flat on the first floor here. Because I've looked at the plans, and fascinatingly, this tower up at the top actually holds the wash house for the flats. And here we have a photo of him in middle age. He was a GP, assistant surgeon at the Royal Infirmary, becoming a professor of anatomy at St Mungo's College in 1922, and among other honours was a fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons in Edinburgh, England and Glasgow, one of the first to do so. He was known for his pawky humour, and wee Jimmy suffered from delicate health, perhaps from growing up so close to heavy industry, but he did live until he was 80. And I have photographs of his sisters too. From their ages and clothes, these photos would have been taken while they were living in Dixon Avenue. Caroline was the 3rd child, and the 3 other sisters were closer in age to each other. Here they are, presumably in their Sunday best, with gorgeous white gloves and shoes at the photographer's studio. They all went to Hutchison's Girls' Grammar School, which opened in 1876 in this building on Elgin Street, and it later expanded into a building on the corner here. And if we look at a couple of photographs, we can see more clearly exactly where this is today, because it's at Eglinton Toll. So the building is just behind here. And these tenements are the ones that are opposite the power station, and that building there is their school. So you can see how their route to school from Dixon Avenue takes them through all these towers belching smoke. But the girls certainly made the best of their opportunities. Here we have them as young women, 2 of them in their graduation gowns from Glasgow University. The eldest sister, Caroline, was married from Dixon Avenue in 1904 to Andrew Kane, a house factor, and they had 2 daughters who lived into their 90s. Elizabeth married the Reverend John McWilliam and went to live with him in Arbroath in 1912, and they had a child together. And Margaret was an art student in 1911, gained her MA from Glasgow University that year. Mary, the youngest daughter, gained her MA from Glasgow University again in 1909 and became a school teacher. She was married in 1916 to George Roberts, a marine engineer with the British India Steam Navigation Company, and he'd lived in Calcutta previously. Their son George was also a doctor. In 1908, the Mattersby family moved from Dixon Avenue to a larger house in Bruce Road in Pollokshields. As you can see from the map, every house has its own name and a huge garden. Very few are even semi-detached. Built in the late 19th century, their house is called Ingleside and it's now called Crosshail. It's on a wide road, which has very little traffic even still. It's now a Category B listed building, although we don't know who the architect is, but they were clearly influenced by Greek Thompson. Unfortunately, their mother died here in 1913. The next year, young Margaret, and this is her in the photograph, she was married from the house to Leonard Langton, a customs and excise officer, and became a school teacher in Tobermory. Their daughter, Margaret, also became a doctor. The family's move up the social scale is complete. All of the girls married professionals, some had careers, and their descendants number a very large number of doctors. David Hardy is not to be left out. He gained his MA from Glasgow University in 1905, and 4 years later his LLB, becoming a writer-solicitor in West Regent Street. He married Mary Drummond in 1916, and their son James was a pilot killed in the Second World War in 1943. The youngest brother, Robert Gloag, who I unfortunately do not have a photograph of, was another doctor, but he had a shorter and sadder life. He married Euphemia in 1913, but their daughter was perhaps stillborn, and Euphemia drowned herself in Loch Lomond in 1930. Robert married again, but he was to die 10 years later in 1941 of cerebral meningitis, when he was buried with his parents in Cathcart Cemetery. James Mattersby had died at his youngest daughter Mary's house in Newlands in November 1920. His will listed a number of flats and houses he let out in Hutchison Town. All his children, except William Mason, had made the move into the middle class, with 3 generations of doctors in some cases, mostly living really long lives. The homes they lived in as a family grew larger and more private, and by 1914 included a holiday home in Cairn on the Cowal Peninsula. Enriching social mobility and defeating the disadvantages of where they grew up could be possible in Victorian Scotland. So now on to the second part of my talk, which is a really quick look at the work of the architect of my house, Robert Duncan. Here's a wee potted biography of him with some of the notable events in his life. He was born in Cardross, one of 5 children. His father was a builder, but had died by the time Robert was 10. The family moved to Glasgow by 1861. His younger brother, Ebenezer, became a doctor and the founder of the Victoria Infirmary. In the 1870s, Duncan went into partnership with John Graham Peat, but by the 1890s, it was all his own business, winding down in about 1909. There's very little written about Duncan, and the wonderful online resource, the Dictionary of Scottish Architects, does not have all of his information correct. I think he deserves to be better known, as he built some very interesting and familiar buildings, like this. This extraordinary building, which Glaswegians should recognise, was commissioned by the grocery company Bishop and Henderson, better known as Cooper & Co, in 1886. It was a flagship grocery store with flats above and perhaps some offices. The ground floor is granite, upper floor is ashlar, and it takes inspiration from the French Renaissance with its mansard roof. Just look at that extraordinary clock tower with its 4 clocks, wrought iron balcony around, and a teeny tiny choragic monument of Lysikrates on the top. This is what it looked like inside. There's decorative plasterwork everywhere, tiles and marble. The main hall has changed a little, mostly the plaster columns being stripped back to their cast iron structure. Interestingly, the bar is in the same place as the grocery counter was. So the whole building's really highly decorated. There's with mostly Corinthian details. The doorway is festooned in flowers with doves sitting on them. There are marble pillars, sandstone pillars, ironwork, scalloped slates, round-headed windows, dormers and finials. In the doorway, we have coloured mint and tiles, beautiful marble in 2 different patterns on the walls and white marble at the doorstep, carving on the banisters, and these banisters from inside where the flats are, they're the same as the ones that were in the shop floor earlier. but they've now gone. Minton tiles, of course, are very hard-wearing and beautiful. It's certainly a statement building for the company and still dominates Great Western Road. Duncan would design several buildings for them, as we shall see later. So let's go back to the houses. So Duncan built most of the south side of Dixon Avenue. So let's have a closer look. They're built in pairs, but all slightly different, as if he's finding his way as he designs them. The entrance doors are in different places for these two pairs of villas. The stairwells are unlike normal Victorian terrace houses in that they're in the centre of the house with slightly different configurations in each home. There are ornate cornices and ceiling rows in my house, but unfortunately it's been stripped of all the original fireplaces. Thankfully, as we saw earlier, the lovely stained glass over the stair remains. We've not discovered much original decor either, apart from the ghost of this floral paper at the bottom left. This is on the scullery wall. And in the middle is some aesthetic looking border paper, which was on the hall. And at the front door, we've got a rather fairly plain design of Minton tiles, but we do have a marble doorstep. I don't have a photograph of Duncan, but thanks to my neighbour, Amin Sharif, I have his signature on his original disposition documents of 1887. Duncan bought the land for the pair of villas next door to mine in November 1887. At the top right, I think you can just see that it says, this is an extract of the fir contract between the trustees of William Smith Dixon of Kelvin Hill and John Henderson, chaplain to the Deaf and Dumb Mission, Renfrew Street. So remember that name. That's who lived at 96 Dixon Avenue in the 1890s. The fir contract for my house between the trustees of William Smith Dixon and Robert Duncan was dated 14th of November 1889, but only a few months later, on the 5th of March 1890, the house was being advertised for sale. It seems that perhaps the house was built in just a few months. Here's a couple of interesting design elements. We've got my cat Vienna sitting on the rather graceful stairs that go up to our attic. And the window on the right is in our bathroom and it looks over the stair. And there's a little gap in the top to let the steam out, for the house did have hot and cold running water. By 1897, Duncan had started to build these red sandstone houses further west along the street. Again, terraces of villas with round bays, but they are a little smaller. And although they were designed and built mostly in pairs, they end up as a completely connected terrace. Up until about 1895, blonde sandstone was quarried within and around Glasgow, for example, underneath Queen Street Station and Cowcaddens. But later, red sandstone from further away in Dumfries and Ayrshire was used more often, as it could be transported by train. Each of these houses has this almost Gothic trefoil fanlight over the door, filled with multicoloured stained glass. They also have basements with ramps down to the coal holes of each house and rather beautiful floral gates, of which a few remain. Beyond the red sandstone tenements are the last pair of Duncan houses, near to the Free Church, which is now the Al Farouk Mosque. The final house in the group, this one, is different. It's designed by a different architect. So these houses have the same floor plan, but are slightly different in details. The fan lights above the doors have a more regular shape. And the bays have 4 windows. And this one on the right has some Glasgow style stained glass in the window as well. If we head to the Cathcart Road end of Dixon Avenue, there's a corner tenement, which is also by Duncan. I don't have an exact date for it yet, and I know he did other tenements in Pollokshields, which I haven't yet found. But the plans in the Mitchell for these shows that these were originally designed to have the shops underneath on the ground floor. And we've got this slightly unusual detail here of a pillar in between windows, which we'll see in other buildings. If we walk round all 3 sides of this block, we end up at Albert Road, where this terrace of 6 houses is like the Dixon Avenue plan, but it's slightly earlier than those red sandstone ones. It's got a slightly more conventional angled bay window at the front and no finial or turret, but the trefoil fanlights give them away as one of Dixon's designs. So this map shows where all of Duncan's houses are in the area that I have so far uncovered. He's taken care with all these houses in the details, the unusual shapes, to make homes for people to live in with their own little gardens and areas. In Pollokshields, the houses he designed may be larger and grander, but they lack a little of the individuality. So he built tenements in Pollokshields and several villas as well. At Springburn Avenue, the left-hand villa was built first, and then 2 years later, he added the right-hand side. We've got repeated decorative elements with the finial, the slate roof, and the brackets under the eaves, and there's a really nice stone cutting detail above all of the windows in this house. Around the corner is White Hill, a very grand B-listed villa. It was built by Walker and Dick in about 1895, and they were the builders who Duncan did a lot of work with. It was built for William R. Gray, ship owner and chandler. The finials and ironwork around the roof are really quite fancy, and they relieve the severe Ionic columns around the front door. The oculus dormer window in the attic is where the billiard room is, but a second owner of the house in 1913 built another billiard room in an extension. And the next year, before he goes back to building Dixon Avenue, Duncan designs this double villa in Flowers Avenue. Again, we've got the unusual configuration of the front doors next to each other in the middle of the building, allowing utility extensions at either side. Bracketed eaves again, finials, and a little classical nod with the stonework over the front door. Only one house has got lovely Art Nouveau Glasgow style stained glass, which was very popular in the 1890s. But Duncan didn't only design homes. This is the former Church of Christ in Copplaw Street, which he completed in 1899. It has a simple pitched roof design with lovely details, including these big solid pillars at either side on the corners. The rustic red sandstone has greatly suffered from losses and wear, but there have been many changes to the building. So I imagine that the windows were originally stained glass before they were replaced with this double glazing. This is just one of a couple of nonconformist churches designed by Duncan. The other is a Gospel Hall in Springburn, built in 1901, which was probably a similar layout, but it suffered major fire damage in 1970 and has been mostly rebuilt. Much of Duncan's work came from commercial and industrial buildings, but this has of course survived less well. In 1886, he designed stables for Bishop and Henderson, the parent company of Coopers, in Rutherford Lane, which is just off Renfield Street here and Hope Street. They cost £470, but it's tricky to see the extent of the building. It's just seen in this photograph on the right of the street with this low building where it says no parking and with a concealed entrance. You can see it more clearly here, and I think that this area is the stables that he built. You can see they're just by, this is the Theatre Royal behind them. And the corrugated iron roof in this photograph is probably the scene dock of the theatre. Now not even the street is left, and it's just this open loading dock at the back of the Theatre Royal. This is another building for Coopers, offices and stores from 1890 in Herbert Street, Kelvin Bridge. Again, I'm indebted to John R. Hume, recorder of Glasgow's industrial past, for these fabulous photographs, which enabled me to match up with maps to identify this impressive building at the end of the street. Alas, also now demolished. In fact, only the red sandstone building on the right-hand side still exists in this street. There's an almost Georgian simplicity to this building with its two setback wings and the unusual chimney configuration right at the front of the building above the front door, either side of this pediment with its demi-lunette opening. However, the most dramatic warehouse he built for Bishop and Henderson is this one from 1898. Another B-listed building, it now dominates the west end of Sauchiehall Street with its glass facade. Dividing the windows are the cast iron columns he used in the Dixon Road tenement block. Classical details and order are everywhere, from the divided pediment at the top to the Corinthian capitals and the careful rhythm of the windows, enlivened by the bays in the middle. It doesn't seem to have been a warehouse for long, for in 1910 it turned into the Electric Circus, one of Glasgow's earliest cinemas. There's been some discussion as to whether this was one of the first facade retentions in the city. In 1926, it became the Locarno Ballroom, a name it retained until the 60s, when it became Tiffany's, and then the Zanzibar, and then a casino in the 1970s. Here's some of those details a bit closer up, including these toothy dolphins, which are up on the pediment. And I'm indebted to Liberal Despot's photographs here because my camera just wasn't up to capturing them. And just around the corner is this building, now known as Sovereign House, but was built in 1893-4 as the Institute for Adult Deaf and Dumb on West Regent Street. Here, Duncan has baronial turrets growing out of the building on top of bay windows with both round and square-headed windows. He utilises the unusual hillside with a basement well protected by railings. Over the doorway, we have that pediment again between solid pillars that we saw on the Church of Christ and the Herbert Street offices. Here it encloses a sculptural relief of Christ healing the deaf and dumb man, which Ray Mackenzie has suggested is by Edinburgh sculptor James Patendry McGilvray, who had a studio around the corner. Here's a photo of the building a little bit closer in time to when it was designed by Duncan, before the church was added at the left in 1929. Now, do you remember the owner of 96 Dixon Avenue, John Henderson, the chaplain and missionary to the Deaf and Dumb Mission in Renfrew Street? It looks like when the mission wanted new premises in 1893, Henderson commissioned his architect neighbour who had built the house he lived in. At this time, there was intense controversy about the teaching of sign language and fingerspelling and deaf people acting on their own account. A religious and temperance organisation, this charity had church services in finger and sign language and provided interpreters. And here you can see the sculptural relief and the beautiful ironwork lanterns. There's a huge combination of stylistic detail here with quite Renaissance fronds and ogies on this sort of frame where the Institute name has been chiselled off for Sovereign House. But on the top, the Anthemian details are rather Greek Thompson in their sparse simplicity. Since the 1990s, part of the building has been the home of Kepi architects, descendants of Mackintosh Kepi. Now, a quick look at Duncan's largest building from 1902, which unfortunately no longer exists. Oakland Hills Sanatorium in Kinrossshire, set in an estate of 460 acres with a fish pond in front. It was a TB sanatorium for those who could afford 5 guineas a week in recovery. The Glasgow Medical Journal tells us the building cost £35,000 and no trouble or expenses have been spared to make the sanatorium as perfect as possible in every detail. The opening ceremony was presided over by Duncan's younger brother, Dr. Ebenezer Duncan, and after a ceremony where it was opened by an ancient key, the visitors then proceeded to inspect the interior of the building, the electrical appliances, the septic tank sewage system. Again, we have a rather baronial red sandstone building with little turrets at each end and oriel windows, finials and a delicate lantern in the middle. This was removed by the 1940s. Perhaps it was made of wood and difficult to maintain. The hospital closed in 1987 and unfortunately was demolished after 2001, and there's now houses being built on the site. This is one of the last buildings Duncan built, a laundry and battlefield for the Mrs. J&J Walker in 1906, also now demolished. The brick building has all been painted white at some point, and the sash windows visible at the front are decorated with designs from different coloured bricks. You can see immediately it is a smaller echo of the Cooper's offices and the Church of Christ. We have the rather unusual demi-lunette above the central door, flanked with pillared chimneys at the apex of the front. Here, for practical reasons, the lunette has louvers and the door is on a barn slider with a ramp leading to it. So those of us who live in Govanhill, Crosshail know that this area, so vibrant for years with waves of immigrants from all over the world, is regenerating itself even through the difficulties of the last 18 months. The spirit of the Mattersbys, who wouldn't let disadvantaged beginnings hold them back from education and improvement, is still walking our streets. Dixon Avenue and Crosshill are now in a conservation area, due in no small part to the unusual homes and buildings built by Robert Duncan. I hope that this quick tour through his work has made some new architectural connections across the city for you. And obviously with lockdown, I haven't been able to access archives or felt it appropriate to request access to go inside buildings. And I'm aware there's still a lot to find out about Duncan. So I'm keen to hear from anybody who knows more about any of these buildings. Please do get in touch, and thank you for listening to me. And I will now pass it back, since let's see if there's any questions.
Ailsa, thank you so much for that fantastic talk. We do have a few questions. We only have 2 minutes left, I'm afraid, so we'll
Sorry
just
for
do
that.
one question. There's been lots of information in the chat from Morag Cross as well, and I've saved the chat and I'll pass that on to you. So thank you, Morag, for contributing. Okay, we've got time for one very, very quick question. Wonderful talk and images. Thank you. Brilliant research. What discovery surprised you most along the way? And do you know if the notorious son chose to leave the uni and his medical degree programme, or if the uni kicked him out? And that's from Laura Rattray.
Well, I don't know exactly, and have yet to see if the university has records for students who left. I have a feeling they may not do. But what did surprise me was that so many of the children had a university education, and it was just wonderful to see those photographs of the sisters in their graduation gowns. It's just fabulous seeing early female graduates of the Glasgow University. So that was really special, seeing the photographs of the people who used to live in my house.
Thank you so much, Ailsa. I'm afraid that is all we have time for. I'd just like to quickly say that if the attendees would like to fill in our survey, there is that £100 voucher for a Glasgow local business of your choice. And with that, we'll leave it there. Ailsa, again, thank you so much.
Thank you.